Welcome to Functional Philosophy. I'm Charles Tew. That's T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. This is episode number 23, and its title is Why People Join the Alt-Right. Hello everyone. A few things before I get into the meat of today's episode. I have been considering moving this section to the back half of the show. Some people seem to get annoyed that I take so much time up front. Now, this is standard practice for podcasts. Sam Harris regularly takes 10 minutes or more to do what he calls housekeeping, just keeping listeners appraised of what's going on with the logistical and technical, you could say meta details of the show. I've considered moving this to the back half of the show so that I can get right into the topic and people don't have to wait. But that seems anticlimactic. I'm not sure if that's the best way to go, and I think for now I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to because this show is not for the kind of listener who complains about that. This show is for people who come to recognize that I have interesting things to say on all manner of topics, even topics that he may not have originally been interested in. It's not for that kind of listener who finds me because I'm talking about one specific issue and he wants to hear about that issue. If you're that kind of listener, I'm glad you're here, but this show is for regular listeners. And if I'm going to do this for regular listeners, then I have to be able to communicate things about the show in general, which takes time. That's just a fact of reality. Whenever I put out an episode that involves something popular, like Jordan Peterson or Gavin McInnes, I get an anomalously high number of listeners who aren't interested in anything but the specific topic and aren't going to listen to anything else I do. So, if you're one of those kinds of people, then just going to have to tough it out, or don't listen. That's fine too. You don't have to listen to what I say. I always knew that if I were successful on my own terms, I would not have that many listeners, because I'm attracting a very rare kind of listener. I'm attracting the kind of person who is actually interested in novelty. Now, everybody says he's interested in novelty, but he's not. Most people are actually interested in being fed the same slop they've had a million times. They claim that they are interested in novelty because what they are actually interested in is nihilistic garbage, and they can't justify that straight. So what they say is, well, at least it's interesting. At least it's original. But they don't actually care that it's original. That's just the excuse. And so when things that are actually original come along that they disagree with, they just reject it out of hand. So if you actually want original content, this is the place to listen. But it's going to be actually original and challenging. This is not going to be the same thing you hear over and over again. You know, I did an episode on moral choice systems in video games. And people reacted negatively to it. A lot of the people who claim that they love original new ideas, well, they don't. What they want is to be told for the millionth time that, well, you know, games should be more gray. The decisions should be more ambiguous. It's boring to have black and white choices. Well, if you actually defend black and white choices, which you never hear anywhere, that's an interesting original take. Nobody wants to hear that, because they don't actually care about original ideas. Now, I myself listen to things that I disagree with just because they're original, just because they're novel. You can learn from wrong things that are original. You can learn new ways of being wrong, new ways people go wrong. But they have the worst of both worlds. They are wrong and want novelty only as a way of justifying their wrongness of saying, well, who cares, at least it's original. Now what I have is the best of both worlds. I'm right, but I also like originality for its ability to help you understand even more. They like originality as a way of ensuring that there is nothing to understand at all. That it's all just experimentation. And you ever notice this paradox in the people who worship experimentation? They don't actually ever like solutions. It's experimentation as an end in itself. Experimentation is valuable because it helps you find solutions. It helps you gain knowledge. But they don't like that. As soon as you find a solution, I'll throw that out, let's go back to experimentation. Anyway, so that's that. Now, as for last week's episode about Jordan Peterson, I was disappointed with the response I got from Peterson fans. They were dumb and dishonest. I should have expected that, but what can I say? I'm an optimistic person by nature. So that was disappointing, but one criticism was that I kept just taking things for granted, saying, oh, well, Peterson's ideas about these Jungian archetypes are obviously ridiculous. We don't have innate ideas. And people were saying, well, that's not obvious. You didn't give an argument for that. Okay. Think about an atheist show. And one of the panelists says that the idea of God creating the earth in a matter of days, the universe in a matter of days, is ridiculous. And some Christian says, well, what the hell? You didn't explain why that's ridiculous. You didn't explain why that's obviously wrong. You didn't give an argument. Now, what would the atheist say? Yeah, I didn't give an argument. I have to take something for granted. This is a show by an atheist. I'm taking certain things for granted. I can't reconstruct the entirety of human knowledge from the axioms on up every time I talk about anything. Communication would be impossible then. Every time you speak, you are starting from some point. You're taking something for granted. That's what I was doing. Now, if you are on such a low level that Peterson doesn't seem obviously wrong to you, then all I can say is read Ayn Rand and get smarter and make yourself worthy of listening to me. If you would not like to do that, then thank you for your brief stay here, and goodbye. Why are people joining the alt-right? What about that movement makes it attractive to the kind of people who join it? Well, in order to answer that, you first have to understand what the alt-right is. What is the distinguishing characteristic of the alt-right? It hasn't always been here. It's here now. What differentiates it from everything else that already exists? The answer is the emphasis on race. The alt-right are racial collectivists, white racial collectivists. They believe that the content of a man's mind and character are determined by his race. This is what is unique about them. Now, it's not everything they believe, but this is the essence of what they believe. This is what makes them different as a political movement. Now, most of them that I have seen, the intellectuals anyway, say that they are white nationalists, or ethno-nationalists, to put it more broadly. Not white supremacists. Now, I believe them. This is the most consistent form of that worldview. If you believe that everything about you is determined by your race, then the idea of an external objective perspective is actually incoherent. The idea of supremacy is incoherent. You can only judge from within your own perspective. So the idea that the white way is good and the black way is bad, that doesn't make any sense from the perspective of somebody who doesn't believe there's any common ground from which to judge. You're just irreducibly different. You have irreducibly different perspectives depending on your race. So the two things that characterize a racist movement, and that's what they are one, the imputing of everything important about an individual's intellectual and characterological character to his race. And two, the advocacy of the racial group as the standard of value for an individual who belongs to that group, or the group's existence and benefit as the standard of value. They believe that you as an individual don't exist. You should have children so that you can prolong the white race, even if you don't want to have children, because what matters is the collective and not you, the individual. Your desires don't matter in the face of the needs of the group. So the alt-right are simply white racists. They believe that race determines everything important about you and that your goal should be to act for the benefit of your race. That is all racism is. Now, the ideological movement being led by the intellectuals of the alt-right has also given a boost to the nationalist movement, the non-racist nationalist movement. These people usually call themselves alt-light, and the reason I don't consider the alt-right to be essentially nationalistic is because we've always had nationalism. That is not what is new about them. What is new about them is the racial element. But nationalism is catching on. It is, the way is being paved for it by the alt-right, who are also nationalists. They're just racial nationalists. Now, it's important here to clarify what nationalism is. Nationalism is not patriotism. Nationalism is not the view that the American state should be concerned with protecting the rights of Americans and not everyone else. That is the correct view. That is not the view of nationalism. Nationalism is state collectivism. It is the idea that the state should act for the benefit of the state, or the nation, as opposed to other nations. It views the interests of nations as necessarily clashing, and it sees a role for the state in fighting other nations for the benefit of its own people. It also sees a role for the state in intervening within the affairs of its own people for their benefit, and not just in a way that protects rights. I'm not saying they intervene to put murderers in jail, but they intervene for the greater good of the people. So nationalists are fine with socialized medicine, for instance. You actually see the current white nationalists advocating for it. They are fine with trade barriers, because they don't see the state's role as protecting the rights of individuals, which is what free trade does. They see the state's role as making the best deals for the people. Not the individuals within the state, but the people as a transcendent entity. So they fall into this trap that all collectivist systems do. This is the trick of collectivism. They identify one person or group or industry as the representative of the people, and then proceed to sacrifice other individuals for those individuals. But they say that's fine because those individuals, they have the football right now. They are the representatives of the people. So with trade barriers, they do this. They will say, well, it's fine for us to put a tariff on Toyota cars to help Ford, because we're helping America by helping an American company. Now, of course, they're actually hurting America overall. America defined as all of its individuals, because consumers have to pay more for cars now, and they're Americans, are they not? In fact, there are more American consumers than there are people who work at Ford. So the logic here just breaks down. But this is how all collectivist systems work, and this is how nationalism works. And you see this rise in nationalism. It's becoming more palatable. That's what Trump is. I don't think Trump is racist. I mean, he's obviously not, I think. But he is a nationalist. And a fascist is really nothing other than a nationalist who seeks to implement nationalism through a system of nominal private property rights. And that's what Trump is doing. He's a big supporter of interfering in free trade and of eminent domain and of basically a system in which people have the right to their property unless the state decides it can be put to better use for the nation. So fascism can be racial or non-racial, and we have both sides surging today. And the alt-right are the racial side, the racial faction of the broader nationalist movement. And they are the ones really leading the way, and it makes sense because they're the most consistent. And moderates don't count in history. Being a moderate is an inherently passive stance, because you aren't defining the poles between which you are moderating. You are letting other people set the standard and then saying, whatever they say, I'm in the middle. So the extremists set the terms, and the alt-right are the extremists here. Now, don't let the fact that there aren't that many people on the alt-right fool you. It's true that the media is making them out to be more numerous than they are, but intellectual minorities are the ones who change the world. As I said, moderates simply let the extremists tell them what to do, and they passively absorb it. I mean, how much more cultural tolerance is there for all kinds of freakish social and sexual attitudes than there was before? Why is that? Well, it's because of social justice advocates. People don't have to become die-hard social justice warriors in order for die-hard social justice warriors to have an effect. Do you think everyone in Nazi Germany was just a hyper-Nazi? They weren't. But they don't have to be. They go along with the leaders. You only need a few ideological people to lead everyone else off a cliff. There's a story that I think is apocryphal, and I think it was supposed to have been Lenin who said that there are now 6 people who fully understand communism. The success of the revolution is assured. And what he meant, of course, was that all you need are a few people who truly get it and fight for it. And then there's no stopping them. Most people are not intellectual. They go along with the intellectuals. You know, the battle for hearts and minds, to use that cliched phrase, is actually a very small battle. It's always the case that the fate of the world hangs in the balance of a very small fight. So just as you see this, what is actually a small minority of social justice intellectuals having this massive impact on the culture, the alt-right will do the same thing. So do not let the fact that there aren't that many of them give you a false sense of security. It's important that there are as many of them as there are, and that they are the only alternative out there to social justice and nihilism. They are going to win by default if nobody else fights them. But anyway, so the alt-right is here. They are white collectivists, and they are giving a boost to nationalism of all kinds. Okay. That's what the alt-right is, and that is what they are doing. So the question is, why are people joining the alt-right? What is attractive about this movement, especially to young people? You see this mostly on the internet. Why do they find this appealing? It comes down to identity. In fact, this is what they call themselves, identitarians. Now, this is just another word for racists. They call themselves identitarians, but where are they getting their identity? From their race. They're just using identitarian because racism has a bad name. But that's what they are. So I'm going to call them white racists. That's what they are. So, sorry, you can't get away from that just by taking a new word. I mean, I'm an objectivist, and we don't run from selfish just because it has negative connotations. If you think the content of your concept is good, you fight to make people understand why it's good. You don't choose a new name like some marketing idiot. You see, they try to do this with capitalism. They call it the free market because it focus tests better. That is so dumb and impractical. It betrays an utterly unphilosophical mind. But anyway, the alt-right. People are joining because they need an identity. They lack an identity. And the alt-right is preying on that. They're saying, you have no identity. I've heard Richard Spencer say this. He talks to groups of young people and he says, how do you define yourself? By what kind of music you like? You like sports? Things like that? That's all superficial. You need a real identity, and the way to get that is to adopt the identity that is just in you already. You just have to recognize it. Your internal chemistry, your biology provides you with a ready-made set of values. So adopt that. Feel like you are somebody. Now, a crucial point here is that what is an identity? The identity of a human being is his values. That's what define you. Your values. So your fundamental values define your fundamental identity. And young people, and older people too, lack an identity these days. Why do they lack an identity? Well, it's because they are told to be selfless. Don't even think about your own values. That's immoral. And in addition to this, they are told that all values are subjective. Now, if you believe values are subjective, there is no way to feel passionate about them. There are really only 3 popular schools of thought on values today. One is the religious school, which says values are just intrinsic and you should do what God says. There aren't that many people like that. I mean, who take it seriously. The other school is the one that says values are totally subjective and it's really impossible to have values and you shouldn't have any and you should just be a nihilist. That's also not the most popular school. The most popular school is really the existentialist school of thought. You will hear this from basically anybody non-religious who talks about this issue. They say you have to create your own meaning. Now, even a child will understand that if everything is subjective, there is no way to create your own meaning. And so he will never be passionate about anything he arbitrarily chooses to value. He may pretend to be passionate about it, but he really isn't. And that is what makes Richard Spencer's claims of superficial values plausible. Because most people do only have superficial values. Because they are taught to believe that everything is subjective. And so, how do you really get started? How do you have values? Where do they come from? You just make them up. That's the only answer they're given. And so there's this emptiness. Most people are just prey for any ideology that comes along and says, I'm going to fill you up. I'm going to tell you how to be somebody, how to have something inside. I used to work with a guy who was just adamant that you knew he was a country boy. He would talk about tractors all the time, and tobacco, and anything stereotypically southern country. He would talk about music, country music. He would speak with an exaggerated southern accent. He needed you to know this, that this was his character. Now, he had slipped on this archetype, the archetype of the country boy. Why? Why did he feel the need to play this character? Well, because he saw this character as having definite values. To have an identity is to have definite values. You have preferences, strong preferences. I like this, I don't like that. You will notice when you see somebody with strong preferences, you think, wow, there's something to this person. He has a core. He has an identity. Now, everybody understands this. Shaken, not stirred, right? James Bond. There's something to him. He has this strong preference. He has an identity. That's what was attractive about the country boy archetype to him. Wow, I like country. I don't like rap. I like cheap beer. I don't like fancy city slicker wine. Now, he didn't care about the values per se. What he cared about was having values. That's what he desperately wanted. Surely everyone knows someone who likes the idea of being smart or well-read, but doesn't actually like engaging in intellectual tasks or reading. So this kind of person will have a bunch of books, may name drop them all the time, but doesn't actually read that much, or if he does, he forces himself to and doesn't really care. Why would somebody put himself through this agony? And people do it a lot. Why does somebody care about the idea of being well-read, but not about reading? I mean, there are a million examples of this in all fields. People who like the idea of being a certain way, but they don't actually like being that way. Well, the reason is they are looking for an identity. They're looking to slip something on. To play a character that has definite values, because they don't have them, and they're trying to get them. And they're doing this in a second-handed way by observing other kinds of people who have definite values, and they say, well, I don't know how to get values, so I'll just adopt this persona. But of course, because it's not motivated by anything internal, it's not motivated by their own independent judgment and evaluation, they're just adopting it from other people, ready-made, canned. It feels superficial to them because it is. So then somebody like Richard Spencer comes along and he says, oh, that's superficial, And it resonates. People say, yeah, it does feel superficial. And then Richard Spencer says, well, it feels superficial because it's not based on your race. If you just listen to your cells, listen to your DNA, it will tell you what you should do. And if you can't fully understand it, I'll help you. I'll tell you what to do. Just trust me. So this is the whole story. People are taught that there is no objective basis for values, and so they don't know the first thing about acquiring them, And so to the extent that they adopt any, they do so in a second-handed, superficial manner. They feel uncomfortable with it, and then somebody comes along and attempts to explain that and offer real values to them, and they are just ripe for that. So this is why people join the alt-right, because they are pathetic losers and cowards who have not taken the responsibility of judging independently seriously. Now you can say there's an extenuating circumstance, and there is. The whole culture is against that, so it takes an exemplary kind of person, an outstanding kind of person, literally outstanding, to overcome this. Nonetheless, you have free will, you could have done it. If you hadn't, it is your fault to a certain degree. Now, something can be the fault of more than one person at once. This is something most people don't understand. Multiple people can share in the blame for a single thing. And this is one of those cases. The intellectuals are at fault, and so are the individuals who let the intellectuals lead them astray. So if you are somebody who finds the alt-right appealing, you are a pathetic, cowardly loser. Now the good news is you don't have to be. You can understand what's wrong with what they are offering you, and then decide to have the courage to stand on your own, judge for yourself, and find out what you want out of life. Now the way the alt-right tries to portray it is, that's cowardly. That's selfish. Self-indulgent. It's easy to just go along with what you want. What's hard is to submerge yourself in the collective, to subordinate your own interests to the traditions of your race, to the continued existence of your race. Precisely the opposite is true. What's easy is to let somebody else, like Richard Spencer or Jared Taylor, tell you what to do. What's not easy is to figure out what you want and then go after it in the face of social pressure, of which you will face a hell of a lot more if you're an individualist than a collectivist, racial or otherwise. So if there is anyone listening who recognizes the truth of what I've said and was attracted to the alt-right, then I don't want to leave you hanging. I want to give you some clues for how to do this on your own. How to not rely on other people to tell you what to do. Now, in terms of practical tips, the best thing you can do is think about what you were interested in as a child. Is there anything that has always given you a unique sense of satisfaction? So it may be that you loved Legos. There's just a different feeling about it. It's not just another thing you like. It is, as I said, the way I've always described it, as a unique sense of satisfaction. So think about anything that's given you that feeling, and then see what kind of occupations involve productive work on the basis of the principle of action that gave you that feeling. So the Lego example implies that you might like to be an architect. Or it doesn't have to be that obvious. If you like fitting things together like that, maybe you would like to be some kind of cryptologist or something. Because you like deciphering things. That's what you liked about Legos. Figuring out how to put them together is an instance in your mind of solving problems like that. The best example I can give you is my own, because I know it really well. When I was trying to decide what to do with my life, I thought back, and I noted two things that I always loved beyond everything else. First, I loved getting to the bottom of things. Whenever anyone said anything, I would always think, well, what's underneath that? What are you taking for granted in what you just said? I was without explicitly thinking of it in this way, I was checking premises. I wanted to get to the bottom, the foundation. I was a budding epistemologist, a budding philosopher. Eventually I realized getting to the bottom of everything is what philosophy is. And the second thing I noted was that I always loved explaining things to people. I loved figuring things out and then also figuring out the best way of organizing an idea for digestion by another human mind. And you put those two things together, what I want to be is a philosopher. Because a philosopher figures out the fundamentals of everything, and then the productive part of that is explaining it to other people. So that's just my personal example. You have to do something like that. Figure something out like that. What aspect of reality interests you and can be incorporated into a productive career? That's what you should be thinking of. You should not be thinking, what can I do to promote the continued existence of my racial group? You will never get satisfaction out of that endeavor. In fact, you will find that if you try to, you will end up feeling just as empty as you did when you were trying to be the country boy kind of person. Because racial values are a lie. It's just as empty as any other archetype you try on. Because it's not based on anything that's the product of your own ego. Anything that relies on the subordination of your ego to something else is not going to produce any kind of meaningful life. Because meaningful means meaningful to someone. So if you're trying to find something that's going to be meaningful to you, then it has to involve your values for you. That's actually a contradiction to talk about your values for the racial group. How can you have values? How can your fundamental standard be for something external to you? It's a contradiction to say, the thing I'm interested in most, primarily, is something that has no impact on me. Well, if it has no impact on you, why is it a value? How can you justify that as a value to yourself? You can't, actually. Which is why all of these systems rely on mysticism and irrationality. In fact, Richard Spencer says, this whole mentality, this whole ethno-state idea and racial collectivism, it is irrational. I mean, he says that openly. He says it's not rational. It's just an irrational urge people have. Don't think about it, don't worry about it, just do it. Well, you should be pretty suspicious whenever somebody starts bringing in irrationality. People only bring in irrationality when they know they can't defend their ideas on rational grounds. So they want to nip that objection in the bud. So you can't later say, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, I already told you it's not based in rationality. Oh, okay. So be suspicious of that. That little trick. It's not really a trick. It's just something any honest person should recognize as a red flag, the biggest red flag there is. When somebody tells you essentially just to do something, don't worry if it makes sense. So the message here is, do worry if it makes sense. Realize that it doesn't make sense to try to get your values from some intrinsic, racial essence whispering to you that you should prefer this or that, or sacrifice for, the white race. Throw that out, figure out what you want out of life, and go after that. If you have any questions about today's episode, you can just send me an email at charles.a.2@gmail.com. You can also visit my website at charlestew.com. There you can find information on and links to all my work, including ways to support it. Thanks for listening. Let's meet again in episode 24.